Dear listener, there was a time in the history of Islam when the month of Ramadan arrived like any other month. The sun would rise over the deserts of Arabia, merchants would travel, families would eat and drink as usual, and no divine command required believers to abstain from food from dawn to sunset. The word Ramadan existed, but the obligation we now associate with it had not yet descended. That reality alone invites reflection. If fasting is now one of the pillars of Islam, why was it not commanded from the very beginning? To understand this, we must return to the earliest days of revelation in Makkah. The first 13 years of Islam were not years of legal detail. They were years of foundation. The Quran revealed during that period focused intensely on belief, on Tawheed, on the hereafter, on accountability, on the unseen world. Hearts were being reshaped before laws were being imposed. Faith had to be planted deeply before discipline could be demanded consistently. The early Muslims were few, vulnerable, and persecuted. They were beaten, boycotted, mocked, and isolated. Some were tortured publicly for declaring belief in one God. In such an atmosphere, survival itself was a test. The focus of revelation addressed identity. Who is Allah? What is the truth? What awaits beyond death? The Quran built spiritual conviction brick by brick. Without that conviction, legal obligations would have felt like burdens instead of acts of devotion. Divine legislation does not descend randomly. It descends with timing and wisdom. In Makkah, the Muslim community was not yet a state. It had no political stability, no economic independence, no collective structure. Islam at that stage was forming individuals, not governing society. Fasting, in its full communal sense, requires order. It requires a shared calendar, collective awareness, and social cohesion. These conditions did not yet exist. Meanwhile, Arabia itself was spiritually fractured. Tribal loyalties overpowered moral consistency. Worship was scattered among idols and inherited customs. There were traces of previous monotheistic practices, including forms of fasting among earlier religious communities, but there was no unified, divinely guided structure. The month of Ramadan passed, but it did not yet carry the sacred rhythm it would later hold. This gradual approach reveals something profound about how Allah prepares His servants. Before commanding hunger, He commanded belief. Before disciplining the body, He anchored the heart. Before asking believers to restrain their desires from dawn to sunset, He taught them to restrain their souls from disbelief and injustice. Spiritual infrastructure precedes legal architecture. Imagine if fasting had been made obligatory in the earliest days of persecution. The fragile community, already strained by hardship, might have experienced obligation without stability. Instead, Allah nurtured their certainty first. He strengthened their trust in Him. He cultivated resilience through patience and prayer. By the time fasting would be commanded, it would not feel foreign, it would feel purposeful. Ramadan, as we know it, was not born in a vacuum. It emerged from years of preparation. The believers had already learned to endure hunger during the boycott. They had already learned to sacrifice comfort for faith. They had already chosen Allah over ease. The soil was ready. And when the time came to transform Ramadan from a passing month into a pillar of Islam, the command would descend not upon uncertain hearts, but upon a community prepared to obey. To understand when and how that command finally came, we must leave Makkah behind and follow the believers to a new city, Medina, where Islam would move from survival to structure. When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions left Makkah and migrated to Medina, Islam entered a new phase. The Hijrah was not merely a change of geography, it was a transformation of circumstance. In Makkah, believers struggled to survive. In Medina, they began to build. The faith that had been planted in secrecy and defended under persecution was now preparing to shape society. Medina was different. It was not dominated by a single hostile elite determined to crush the message. Instead, it offered space to gather openly, space to pray publicly, space to establish order. The Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was no longer only a preacher calling people to Tawheed. He became a leader guiding a community. With leadership came responsibility, and with responsibility came legislation. This is where divine wisdom becomes evident. Obligations in Islam did not descend all at once. They were revealed gradually, matching the growth of the believers. Prayer was formalized, charity was structured. Social laws began to define marriage, trade, inheritance, and justice. Islam moved from being a persecuted belief system to a functioning way of life. Fasting belonged to this phase. In Medina, the Muslim community had rhythm. They had a mosque at the center of their lives. They gathered regularly for prayer. They experienced unity in ways impossible in Makkah. Shared discipline now became possible because shared stability existed. Fasting is not only an individual act, it is communal. It unites rich and poor, leader and laborer, in the same daily struggle against hunger. That unity requires order. There were already precedents for fasting. The Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, observed the fast of Ashura, and upon arriving in Medina, he found the people of the book fasting on this day. He commanded the believers to fast as well, linking them to the tradition of Musa, a.s. At that stage, fasting was recommended and encouraged, but not yet fixed, as a month-long obligation. The companions were becoming familiar with voluntary restraint before they were commanded to institutionalize it. This gradual preparation highlights a powerful principle. Allah trains before He commands. He cultivates readiness before He imposes duty. By the time the command for Ramadan fasting descended, the believers were no longer spiritually fragile. They had tasted victory and defeat. They had experienced brotherhood between the Muhajirun and the Ansar. They had seen Islam organizing daily life. Medina was a laboratory of faith in action. Brotherhood contracts replaced tribal hostility. The Constitution of Medina outlined coexistence. The mosque became both a sanctuary and headquarters. In this environment, discipline could flourish. Obedience was no longer survival-driven, it was devotion-driven. And so, when the verses concerning fasting were revealed, they did not descend upon scattered individuals. They descended upon a structured ummah. The believers could now fast together. They could break their fast together. They could feel the collective rhythm of sunrise and sunset as an act of worship, not merely as markers of time. The transition from Makkah to Medina teaches that spiritual maturity invites greater responsibility. When faith strengthens, obligation increases. When a community stabilizes, its moral expectations rise. Fasting was not imposed during weakness, it was entrusted during growth. Medina was the turning point where Islam shifted from belief under pressure to law under guidance. It was here that divine revelation would formally declare Ramadan as more than a month. It would become a pillar. The verses that would reshape the calendar of believers forever were about to descend, defining hunger not as deprivation, but as devotion. It was in Medina, within the growing strength of the Muslim community, that the command finally came. The verses were revealed in Surah Al-Baqarah, clear and direct, yet filled with profound mercy. O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed upon you, as it was prescribed upon those before you, so that you may attain taqwa. With these words, Ramadan was transformed. What had once been an ordinary month became a sacred obligation. The address itself carried weight. O you who believe. This was not a command to strangers, it was a call to hearts already anchored in faith. Allah did not impose fasting upon people unfamiliar with submission. He addressed believers whose conviction had been cultivated through years of revelation and sacrifice. The obligation was tied to identity. If you believe, this path follows. The verse also contained reassurance, as it was prescribed upon those before you. Fasting was not a new burden unique to this ummah. It had existed in previous communities. This connection to earlier prophetic traditions placed Ramadan within a long chain of divine discipline. Hunger had always been a tool of spiritual refinement. The command did not isolate the Muslims. It connected them to a history of obedience, yet the most striking part of the verse was its purpose: so that you may attain taqwa. Fasting was not prescribed for suffering. It was prescribed for awareness, not for deprivation, but for elevation. Taqwa, consciousness of Allah, protective awareness of sin, was the goal. Hunger was the means. Imagine the moment these verses were recited to the companions. They had already endured hardship in Makkah. They had experienced battles, migration, and sacrifice. Now Allah asked them to restrain themselves daily, from dawn until sunset, throughout an entire month. No food, no drink, no indulgence. The command was clear, and yet there was no recorded hesitation, no collective protest, no demand for negotiation. The response of the companions was characteristic of their hearts: obedience. When revelation came, it was received not as a burden, but as trust. They understood that if Allah commanded something, it carried wisdom beyond immediate comfort. Fasting restructured daily life. Dawn acquired new meaning. Sunset became a moment of relief and gratitude. Days were divided not by work alone, but by worship. The body felt hunger, but the soul felt discipline. Ramadan created a rhythm that pulled believers repeatedly back to awareness. Every pang of hunger became a reminder. Every thirst became a quiet whisper: you are fasting for Allah. The command also democratized spiritual struggle. Wealth could not remove hunger. Status could not shorten the fast. Every believer stood equal before the test. The powerful and the poor experienced the same physical restraint. In that equality lay unity. Ramadan became a shared journey. The revelation did more than introduce a practice. It reshaped the calendar of Islam. From that point forward, Ramadan would not simply mark time, it would define it. Generations of believers would measure their years by how they experienced its days. What began as verses recited in Medina would soon become one of the pillars of the faith. But the early days of fasting were not identical to what we practice today. The initial rulings carried stricter conditions that would soon reveal another layer of divine mercy. When fasting was first made obligatory, its rules were stricter than what Muslims practice today. The command had descended, and the believers responded with obedience, but the structure of fasting initially required even greater restraint. At that time, if a person broke their fast at sunset, but then fell asleep before eating, or fell asleep immediately after eating, the window for nourishment closed. Sleep marked the end of permission. From that moment until the following evening, they were required to continue fasting. Imagine the weight of that discipline. A long day under the sun, followed by exhaustion so deep that one might fall asleep unintentionally, only to awaken knowing that food and drink were no longer allowed. The body was tested intensely. Hunger was prolonged. The early Muslim community felt the strain. This stage of legislation reveals something essential about divine training. Sometimes Allah begins with strictness to cultivate seriousness. Obedience is strengthened through challenge. The believers were not merely avoiding food, they were learning total submission. Fasting was shaping their willpower, restructuring their habits, and sharpening their consciousness. There are narrations that describe companions struggling under these early conditions. Some experienced extreme fatigue. Others found the restriction difficult, especially those who labored during the day. Yet despite the difficulty, they did not rebel. They endured. Then, divine mercy descended again. Allah revealed further verses permitting eating, drinking, and marital relations throughout the night until the appearance of dawn. The command was eased. The structure became balanced. What had initially been severe was refined into sustainability. The believers were reminded that Allah does not intend hardship for them, but guidance and completion of His favor. This transition from strictness to ease is not a contradiction. It is wisdom. It shows that Allah understands human limitation. The goal of fasting was never exhaustion for its own sake. It was a transformation. Once discipline was instilled, balance was introduced. The phrase in the Quran, "Allah intends for you ease and does not intend for you hardship," encapsulates this mercy. Fasting remained an obligation, but it became one aligned with human capacity. The day remained a test of restraint. The night became a gift of relief. This progression also teaches a broader principle about divine law. Allah gradually shapes His servants. He does not overwhelm them without preparation. He strengthens them through phases. What begins as a challenge is softened by compassion. What feels heavy becomes manageable through adaptation. The companions witnessed this mercy directly. They experienced both the intensity and the ease. Their appreciation deepened because they knew what stricter discipline felt like. Gratitude is often strongest after difficulty. Today, many Muslims fast from dawn until sunset and feel the strain of hunger, thirst, and fatigue. Yet compared to the earliest form of fasting, our structure carries balance. We are permitted nourishment throughout the night. We are given clear boundaries and clear relief. Understanding this history reframes Ramadan. It is not merely abstention, it is divine calibration. It trains without crushing, it disciplines without destroying. And behind every rule lies purpose. That purpose goes beyond hunger, beyond law, beyond structure. To understand why fasting was made obligatory, we must move beyond how it is practiced and explore what it was designed to create within the human soul. After the command was established and the structure refined with mercy, a deeper question remained. Why fasting? Why hunger? Why thirst? Why abstention from what is otherwise lawful? The Quran does not leave this unanswered. The purpose is stated clearly, so that you may attain taqwa. Fasting was never about starvation. It was about transformation. Taqwa is not a visible garment. It is an internal shield. It is the constant awareness that Allah sees, hears, and knows. Fasting cultivates this awareness in a way few other acts can. Prayer may be observed. Charity may be witnessed. But fasting is hidden. No one can see your hunger except you and your Lord. A person could secretly eat and drink, and the world would not know. Yet the fasting believer refuses, not because people are watching, but because Allah is. This is the essence of discipline. Fasting shifts the battlefield from the outside to the inside. The enemy is not another tribe, not a rival army. It is the nafs, the lower self. Hunger exposes impatience. Thirst reveals irritability. Fatigue uncovers weakness. Through these exposures, character is refined. Ramadan also interrupts routine indulgence. Food is normally immediate and accessible. Desire is often satisfied without delay. Fasting forces pause. It teaches the body that it does not control the soul. It reminds the believer that impulse is not authority. When the sun rises, even water, so essential to life, becomes prohibited. This restriction ingrains obedience. Beyond individual discipline, fasting creates empathy. When hunger settles in the stomach and dryness touches the throat, the believer feels a fraction of what the poor experience regularly. Compassion deepens, gratitude increases, meals are no longer taken for granted. A simple date at sunset becomes a gift. Yet the greatest purpose remains spiritual awareness. Hunger creates clarity. The distractions of constant consumption are reduced. The heart becomes more receptive. The Quran, revealed in Ramadan, is recited with renewed attentiveness. Night prayers feel different when the day has been spent in restraint. The body weakens slightly, but the soul strengthens. Fasting also confronts the illusion of self-sufficiency. Human beings often move through life assuming control. Hunger interrupts that illusion. It reminds us of dependence, on provision, on mercy, on timing. The sunset that signals relief is not commanded by us, it is decreed by Allah. Every iftar is a reminder that sustenance is granted, not owned. And perhaps most profoundly, fasting trains consistency. It is not one day of sacrifice, it is an entire month. Discipline repeated daily becomes a habit. Habit shapes identity. Ramadan is a concentrated school of taqwa. It is 30 days of rehearsal for the remaining 11 months. When fasting was made obligatory, it was not to burden the ummah, it was to elevate it. Hunger was chosen not as punishment, but as purification. Thirst was chosen not as deprivation, but as awakening. The hidden purpose of fasting is that it reveals what is hidden within us. It exposes weakness, so it can be strengthened. It softens hearts, so they can receive guidance. It creates space for reflection in a world filled with noise. Ramadan is not about surviving the month, it is about emerging from it. And that change depends on whether we fast only with our bodies or with our hearts. More than 14 centuries have passed since those verses were revealed in Medina. The command remains unchanged, the obligation stands. Every year, when the crescent moon is sighted, millions of Muslims across continents begin the same discipline. From Africa to South Asia, from small villages to crowded cities, dawn signals restraint and sunset signals relief. Ramadan still arrives, but the question is whether we truly understand why. For many, Ramadan has become familiar. It is associated with family gatherings, special foods, nightly prayers, and a shift in routine. There is beauty in that. There is unity in that. But familiarity can sometimes dull awareness. What was revealed as a transformative obligation can slowly become a cultural rhythm. We fast because it is Ramadan. We abstain because everyone else abstains. Yet the original purpose was deeper than habit. Fasting was made obligatory to cultivate taqwa. That purpose has not changed. The hunger we feel today is meant to awaken the same consciousness that it awakened in the companions. The thirst is meant to remind us of dependence. Daily restraint is meant to discipline our impulses. If Ramadan passes and our awareness of Allah remains the same, then we have observed it, but not fully lived it. In a world saturated with distraction, Ramadan is a pause. It interrupts constant consumption, not only of food, but of entertainment, noise, and excess. It invites us to slow down, to recalibrate, to examine ourselves honestly. Are we fasting only from what enters the mouth, or are we fasting from harmful speech, from impatience, from dishonesty? The body may abstain while the heart remains unchanged. That is not the Ramadan the Quran described. The obligation of fasting also reminds us that worship is not always easy. Discipline requires effort. Waking before dawn requires intention. Resisting irritation requires control. Choosing prayer over sleep requires sacrifice. Yet through that effort, the soul is strengthened. Ease without discipline weakens character. Ramadan restores it. There is also hope embedded in this obligation. No matter how distant a person may feel from Allah during the year, Ramadan offers renewal. It is not merely a command, it is an opportunity. Every fast is a chance to begin again. Every sunset is a reminder that hardship ends. Every night prayer is a quiet conversation with the one who made fasting a path to closeness. When fasting was first prescribed, it reshaped a community. Today, it still holds the power to reshape individuals. But that transformation depends on intention. Are we counting days until Eid, or are we counting moments of growth? Are we enduring hunger, or are we cultivating awareness? Ramadan was made obligatory as mercy, as training, as elevation. The hunger is temporary. The lessons are lasting. The question that remains each year is simple but profound. Will we leave Ramadan with the same people who entered it, or will we allow it to fulfill the purpose for which it was revealed?